This video is a development log of my train game, Steam Revolution. Before talking about new developments, I want to cover a few things that I have already made. The game is written mostly from scratch, so some systems that might already exist in off-the-shelf game engines I need to make for myself. This takes more effort, but the system will exactly match my specific needs. In this video, I'll talk about the system I made for drawing terrain. Because of the nature of my game, there are some ways in which I can simplify my terrain rendering compared to what would be needed for a first-person shooter game. Specifically, in a first-person shooter, you are on the ground and need to draw things that are close to you in high detail. Things that are farther away need to be drawn in lower resolution. In order to prevent gaps or seams between the different resolutions of geometry, it's necessary to have a method for making the low resolutions match up to the high resolutions. Fortunately, Steam Revolution is viewed from top down and uses an orthographic camera projection, which simplifies things. Because the projection is orthographic, sizes of objects remain constant regardless of how close or far they are. This means that I can draw the entire terrain at the same resolution, and I don't have to worry about how different resolutions match up next to each other. I still draw the terrain at different resolutions based on the zoom level. If I didn't do so, the view of the whole overworld map would have too many triangles to render at a reasonable frame rate. At the lowest resolution, I render each world unit of terrain as a pair of triangles. World units are shown as the grid lines in the zoomed-in images. The world is 1376 by 912 units on a side, which is 2.5 million triangles. I also have to draw water, which increases the number a bit more. A few million triangles is a bit on the high side, but they are well-behaved triangles, and modern graphics cards can handle that number. At the highest resolution, I subdivide each grid cell into 4 by 4, which increases the triangle count by a factor of 16. For efficiency, I split the terrain into 16 by 16 unit chunks. For each chunk, I pre-compute the bounding box of the water and ground height maps. Note that in my game, water can be above sea level because of rivers and lakes, so water uses the same height map-based terrain system as the ground. I also pre-compute if the ground is entirely above or below water in each chunk, so that I can skip drawing the water or ground if they are entirely covered. Each frame, I check each chunk to see if it intersects the camera's viewing volume. If it's contained, I set up the shader inputs and submit a draw call. In the worst case of viewing the entire world map, this will result in around 6,000 draw calls, which is also a bit high, but in more typical cases, it will result in a few hundred draw calls. Each chunk actually uses the same mesh, because the mesh topology is the same for any given chunk. The only thing that changes is the height of the terrain. The way that I handle this is to have a height map texture that the terrain vertex shader reads to get the height. Each chunk has a chunk offset passed into the shader to know where to translate the vertices into XY plane, and from where in the height map to read height values. The height map is pre-calculated and is encoded as a one-channel texture with 16 bits per pixel at the full subdivided resolution. The normal map is encoded at the same resolution as a 2-channel 8-bit image, also taking 16 bits per pixel. Each image takes 40 megabytes for a total of 80 megabytes combined, assuming no padding. This fits well within the memory limits of any modern graphics card. An interesting point to mention is that because the meshes are identical between terrain chunks, I could change the code to make a single instance draw call instead of a separate draw call for each chunk. I intend to use instance draw calls at some point in the future, but didn't get around to implementing it yet. I wrote the current terrain system because my original system that the current system replaced was too slow. And once I got the new system fast enough to not bother me anymore, I stopped optimizing to work on higher priority things in the game. You may also notice that the vertex input has a color that is somewhat superfluous. This is only used to differentiate the water as blue versus the ground as green. In the future, I will split drawing of water into a different shader, and will use some other method for determining the color of the ground. For example, I may read the ground color from a separate texture. I already read the color from a separate texture to determine the color of countries and regions within countries. I don't have a clear plan for where I will go with the terrain pixel shader in the future, but I expect that my skills are more in programming than in art, and that I would either attempt to make the ground shader do something procedurally to create a nice visual effect, or lean on a minimalist art style. I haven't decided on the artistic style yet, but I know that artwork and coding will go hand in hand. This is my first development log video, so I'm not sure if I went to enough detail or explained things clearly enough. For example, would it be interesting if I explained the math of how I clip a terrain bounding box against the view volume? Or would people be interested to know how I interpolate terrain heights? If you have any input, leave a comment below.